Welcome, Melody from Canada. You're a respiratory therapist. You want
And
to
an
do
anesthesia assistant as well. I have
a
to
what?
an anesthesia assistant as well.
Oh, is that a thing over there?
Yes. So I know in the US, some states have anesthesia assistants and they also have CRNAs. So here we don't have CRNAs. We only have anesthesia assistants. So they practice almost to the scope of a CRNA. Except we don't do epidurals, and then we have a
Huh.
couple more rules around like induction and emergence and what patients we should or should not be doing things on our own. But yeah.
No way. I never do that. What kind of training did you have to do for that?
So the anesthesia assistant schooling is an additional, like it's like 3 semesters of like didactic and online. The third one is all in hospital and clinical hours. But random side fact about me is I actually was grandfathered in because of my time that I worked in the OR, and I was able to challenge it and then be granted the designation off of the fact that I satisfied the competencies. And this was a couple years ago. So I'm kind of an odd duck that I didn't actually do the schooling for it. But yes, I have worked as an anesthesia assistant, and I know how to do the job. But yes.
Well, welcome. I wanted you to come on because you have some transport experience
I do.
and
Yes.
you wrote a book on. Actually, side note, I was looking something up. I was teaching a class this weekend and somebody had a vent question I wanted to look up and I Googled it and your book was the first thing that came up, your online book.
That's good to hear. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
you want to tell people about that book?
Sure. It's a completely free online book. It's an interactive book. It's an online textbook publication. And it's meant to teach the extreme basics of mechanical ventilation, starting from just the very basic modes, specifically pressure control, volume control, and pressure support is the 3 primary. We touch a little bit on non-invasive, but focusing mostly on those modes and doing it in a very non-threatening way so that anyone, whether they have an RN background, an RT before they go into their schooling, a physician before they carry on with their education, or a paramedic, can take this resource and use it as kind of that very basic understanding so that vents are being taught in a way that is very non-threatening. And I honestly wrote it like half in a fit of rage because I realized that a lot of the resources out there were either taught at a way too high level or a threatening level, and people were coming out of their training either with a fundamental confusion about ventilation and thinking that it was overcomplicated, and it didn't need to be. So just trying to simplify things, make it really approachable for anyone to approach. And then it goes through gases and ABGs as well, and then initial settings and how to kind of focus ventilation and set it up from the beginning all the way to weaning for an adult patient. So that's kind of the idea of the book. So within a 10-hour period, you would have a fundamental understanding.
Well, that's awesome. It is a good book. It's very easy to understand. You initially, we talked about having you come on because you wanted to talk about SIMV and how it's not a good vent mode, and we will
Yes.
get to it. But I asked you to come up with 3 to 5 things that you think the vent novice should know.
I kept it pretty simple here. Yes, SIMV is my number 3, so that's the third one coming at you. But I'll start off with my number 1 thing, and these are from kind of my experience in transport and being introduced to the world of ventilation from a paramedicine and pre-hospital perspective, and just some trends that I've noticed within interacting with different multi-professions. So the number 1 thing that I would want to really drive home to people starting their journey in their mechanical ventilation journey is that 8 mils per kilo is safe. And it is the starting point that I suggest. And I think ventilation, when we talk about our 6 to 8 mils per kilo, our targets for tidal volumes for patients, I think every practitioner who's new to ventilation, they treat it like they would any other drug or any other infusion. And you want to start low because you want to have room to move. But I think ventilation kind of flips that idea on its head. And the idea with ventilation is that actually go big or go home. You want to go with the highest tidal volume first. And the rationale for that, of course, is, you think about your VQ mismatching in your lungs and with your blood flow. And at best, you and I with our healthy lungs are at a 0.8 matching between the two. So then you put in any other pathology in there, you already are losing more of the surface area to oxygenate and your perfusion that's actually getting to the alveoli, that you're not necessarily getting as much bang for your buck that you're really thinking. So when you're going with a smaller tidal volume, you're kind of hamstringing yourself, that a huge percentage of that amount of air is already not necessarily contributing to gas exchange. So when you're initially approaching your patient, start at 8 and see what you get as your outcomes with your pressures, and whether, if it's within that safe range, then 8 is where you should be, because you're going to get more bang for your buck. You're going to ventilate your patient a lot better. And then only if you're not able to do it within your constraints of like your pressure targets and things like that, then you're backing off and you're going towards your 7 and your 6 mils per kilo, and then getting creative.
When you say you're looking at your pressures, are you predominantly looking at plateau pressure, PIP? What are you looking at?
Realistically, it depends, and it depends on what type of mode you're in. So I think most of us are comfortable with the idea of plateau pressure as like the best pressure to look at.
Do you want to real
Because
quick explain what plateau pressure is for the
you're
people out there who are like, what the hell are they talking about?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So remember, with ventilation, at the end of the day, all you're doing is you're blowing up a balloon, right? So regardless if you're blowing up the balloon with a specific pressure or if you're blowing up the balloon with a specific volume, you know that inside that balloon, you're going to have a pressure associated with the air that's in that balloon. And the bigger you blow it up, the more pressure in that balloon, right? So that concept is something that is easier for people to understand when you think about an actual balloon. So volume essentially ends up being a pressure applied, and a pressure applied ends up giving you a volume. It's really the same thing that we're talking about, air in, air out. So whenever you're applying a volume, and we usually talk, regardless of what mode we're in, regardless of what you're doing, in terms of safe volumes for the lungs that we're ventilating, we also have to then look at the pressure that is going to be inflicted in that lung, because both volume and pressure are the same thing. And we want to make sure that the pressure inside those lungs aren't too high, because if you blow up that balloon with too much pressure, you're going to pop it. And the same thing happens with the lungs. So when you're talking about the pressure in the lung system, you have to also think about more than just one pressure number. And that is a factor of the fact that you know that you're breathing through your airway tubes, that if they're more constricted, you're going to have a pressure loss or a pressure associated with going through the tubes, whether they're wide, that would cause less pressure, or whether they're narrow, that would cause a higher pressure. And then you're thinking about the actual pressure of the thickness of the balloon itself you're blowing up, whether the lungs are compliant or able to blow up easily, or whether they have resistance associated with the lung. So overall, in total, the pressure applied in the lung is going to be the pressure needed to go through the tubes, through the airways. That would be the pressure associated with the resistance of the airways themselves, and then also the pressure associated with the lung. So when we talk about ventilation, both of those factors together ends up being our overall high pressure in the lungs, being our peak, or our PIP, our peak inspiratory pressure. But then we don't necessarily care about that when we think about the damage to the alveoli, because we know that some of the pressure that's being lost in the translation through the breathing tubes, through the airways, that is a factor of the airways and how big they are. So we don't have to worry about that amount of pressure loss when we're thinking about the damage that's happening to the alveoli themselves. So we try to take that away. And when we take that away, we're left with just the airway of the compliance of the lung itself, or the balloon, so to speak. And that pressure, we use the term plateau pressure. So the reason it's called that is because if you stop moving air into the lungs and you eliminate the movement of the pressure loss through the tubes, you would do that through a zero flow state. So you're not moving any air in. You would do a pause or a breath hold. And again, this is a review for probably a lot of people, but it's good for those that don't know. You would do a pause or a plateau, and that would give you your plateau pressure, which would then talk about only the pressure needed to open the lung itself. So at the end of the day, we want the pressures to be low, but if we know someone like an asthmatic that has really tight airways, we don't care overall what the pressure probably is going to end up being in the system, because we know those airways are super, super tight. So when we're thinking about the damage that might be happening in the lung, we need to look at the plateau pressure as the be all and end all. So realistically, the plateau pressure is the one that we really, really care about. But we know that if the peak pressure, the highest, which is the cumulative both, is safe, therefore the plateau would be safe as well, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. Yeah.
But I guess the one other thing I wanted to mention is that there's also
Please.
the idea of driving pressure. that is also really
Sure.
important. And
Yeah,
that's
please go into it.
yeah. So the other pressure that is starting to, you'll probably start to read a lot more about it if any people that are listening are starting to read a lot of research, is that now there's a lot of talk about shearing forces as being more. It's the opening and the closing, and that we use that term as a driving pressure. And the best way to think about the driving pressure is the amount of pressure needed to open just the lung itself. So thinking back to what we talked about the pressure loss in the airways and the pressure to open the system, the plateau pressure for the alveoli. The driving pressure would be the difference between the plateau pressure, so just the lung system, not the airways, and your PEEP, your low pressure in the lungs that is always there, no matter what.
As a paramedic or as a flight nurse or critical care transporter, critical care nurse, you kind of have to be a jack of all trades.
Yes.
So I know, I would say now a lot of critical care paramedics like to, I don't know, touch themselves with their vent knowledge and stuff, but I think I know just enough to get by, eloquently speak on it, and troubleshoot. I was always taught to start low, and then you can always go higher because you don't want to hurt the lungs. You're saying start high, check your pressures. As long as your pressures are good, you're not going to cause lung injury.
Yeah. 100%.
Okay.
And like the one thing that I know people are gonna like, you don't want to do that because you feel like you have no room to go. But like to flip the script, to really kind of drive this point home, like if you actually go back to the literature to even think about like ARDS, which is like, worst case scenario, the lungs are really, really damaged. And that like, and you're hearing, terminology thrown out about tidal volumes 4 to 6 mils per kilo and permissive hypercapnia and, allowing the CO2s to climb and all these different things, right? All these different advanced strategies. But like, if you peel back the onion here and actually think logically about it, that if you actually look at ARDSNet protocol when it was written, it is 6 to 8 mils per kilo because you don't go to all those other things until 8 is not safe. Then you go to 7, then you go to 6. And if 6, you're still not, your pressures are too high. That's when you start to go and pull out the other bags of tricks. Okay, so we're increasing the rate. Maybe we're going down to 4 mils per kilo. Oh, that's still not working. Our pressures are dangerous. Okay, now we need to be permissive hypercapnia and allow them to have like really crappy pHs because we're really trying to play with the fact that we're not able to ventilate as big of a breath. So we're allowing our patient to now be acidotic, but you don't go down that pathway if you're effectively ventilating with safe pressures, with your plateau pressure, below 25 centimeters of water. If you're able to do that, then you don't even need to go there. You can be ventilating someone with, moderate respiratory rates and 8 mils per kilo, get your gases perfect in half the time because you're effectively breathing and not losing half of your ventilation to dead space like every breath.
I know this is a loaded question and each patient is different and you have different considerations. What kind of rates are you starting at, or what minute volumes are you targeting for specific patients?
This is going to sound awful because like as an RT, I should have this magical formula to be able to like go to a patient and yes, I can eyeball them and kind of get an idea. But my suggestion is, realistically speaking, when you're picking your initial respiratory rate, like think about your pathology of the lung that you're dealing with. If you have a healthy lung, starting at a rate of 15 is perfect. Like if you have a neuro patient, 8 mils per kilo, rate of 15, start there. See what minute volume you're getting, see what your end titles are, and then start to play around. Maybe you're going up a little bit higher. If you have someone who is tachypnic to start with and they're acidotic and you're obviously not going to start at 15, you're going to start higher. But am I starting like at higher than 22? No, I am starting at maybe a rate of 20, 8 mils per kilo, because remember that you are now flipping the script. You're going from spontaneously breathing patient with a negative interthoracic pressure with their diaphragm working so that those pressures are not traumatic to a positive pressure application. So you have to see how the breath delivered, your inspiratory time that you're picking, how long your exhalation time is, how your patient is synchronizing with your ventilator, whether you need more sedation. You need all those pieces to the puzzle before you're banging the shit out of their lungs, excuse my French, with a rate of like 26, and like tidal volumes that are really shitty.
They kind of beat into our heads. Let's say you have a DKA patient who's breathing at a rate of 40 times a minute.
Yeah.
we're always told try to match their respiratory rate.
Yes, that term match the respiratory rate makes my skin crawl because there's no
Please.
way you can match like an metabolic
Okay.
acidosis. There's no freaking way. And if you try to do that, guaranteed that you're going to have gas trapping. Guaranteed you're going to get
Well,
yourself in an
I always
absolute
thought
shitty
so
situation.
I always thought, let's say we're not following your recommendations, even if we're starting at 4. I always thought if we're matching them at 40 times a minute, you're going to get breath stacking and air trapping
Yes,
no matter
100%. Yes.
what. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
My strong suggestion is like if you have a tachypnic patient with a rate above 30, like always remember that tachypnic patient, the human body only has one option when there's shit going on and acid base is out of balance. The only thing the human body really knows to do, other than DKA, where they do take the Kussmaul breathings, the big breaths, and they're breathing really fast, is really just affect respiratory rate. And if you're dealing with any other lung pathology, where you're dealing with like a COPD patient, fibrotic patient, a septic patient, most of the time they're taking these teeny tiny volumes with high resp rates. But if you have them sedated and you're intubating them, if you give them a better volume, then at the end of the day, you can slow that rate down, see where you are. And if your minute volume is not adequate and your end tidals are climbing, then you start to walk up. And like, yes, when I have someone who their gases are like sub 7.2, like they're less than that, and I know that they're going to need a higher rate, I'm not going to start at a rate of 18. I'm going to probably start at a rate of 22, but I'm not starting higher than that. I'm starting there, which is reasonable because with 22 breaths a minute, you still have 3 seconds per breath delivered. So if you have your I time set at like 0.9, let's say, you definitely have adequate time to exhale. You're not going to have gas trapping. And then you can go from there. And then you can start to play around and see what outputs you're getting on your vent. And within probably about 60 seconds, you're getting them to a point where you can maximize their minute volume, but in a safe way.
All right. This is phenomenal. You also have on your list, I really liked this because I always get mad when when I'm working on a team or I see another flight crew who wants to change stuff just to change stuff on the vent. I'm like, if their numbers look good, don't mess with it. Why are you fucking with it just for the sake of changing things? So you wrote down walk before you run. Just because a vent has special modes doesn't need you need to use them.
Yes. And I think and this is again my suggestion, and as practitioners become more vent savvy and have more additional knowledge and start and potentially are in situations where they are the most knowledgeable person at the bedside when it comes to ventilators, like then obviously as you progress in your practice, do that. But when you're starting, and even within a few years of your practice, if you aren't using ventilators on a regular basis and you are walking into a hospital where a physician or an RT or someone who has had years and years and years of training has worked with that patient and has said, this is the best we've gotten them, don't expect to work a miracle within the 5 seconds that you've known that patient. Like let's check her ego at the door here. Like I never did that as an RT walking into a center. I would never consider doing that. If the gases are good, I'm dropping the mic and I'm focusing on the other crappy situations that I know this patient has to deal with, and I'm going to decrease my cognitive load and focus my work where it needs to go. And then I'm going to let that ride. It's just like on a transport as an RT. If I have a normal gas, I'm not fucking with shit. I'm going to leave it and say, I normalized your gases. Thank you very much. And then I did every other 14 things that I have to do on this transport. I'm not going to be weaning or doing any other crazy things. I fixed one of the issues and I maintained. I digress.
Love it.
I did want to say about the special modes, though. I did want to say, the one thing that always scared me when I would walk into a room where there were people that were very new in their vent journey, and I knew they were because they were from professions where ventilators are not the core of what they do. And I'm not pointing fingers at any specific one. I've worked again with RNs and paramedics, that both sides that I have seen this happen, where they talk about, I've read this article about APRV, and I've seen the capabilities of this mode, and supposedly I can do X, Y, or Z. And, I think we should use it with this patient. And I'm like, this isn't mode tic-tac-toe here. Just because we have it and you haven't used it yet and you read one article doesn't mean that you understand how that mode works. And like specifically with some of the modes, that the ventilators and equipment that these practitioners have, there's so many very small implications to practice with that mode that, like, you don't want to introduce a wild card like that in a transport environment, not knowing the implications on how that's going to impact the patient down the line. Like, don't forget, we see a window of this patient in the transport world, that you're only now seeing this patient for an hour. You may think you're doing a benefit, but are you? Is
Oh
that
my God.
patient then going to be, yeah.
For the listeners who aren't watching the video and who are listening on audio, they can't see that I'm smiling ear to ear. Like, you are speaking to my heart. The majority of patients that I intubate, or the majority of patients that I'm picking up, are intubated for airway protection. There's some freshly intubated trauma patient or a stroke, hemorrhagic stroke, something like that. I get them, but I'm not really taking care of a ton of like these tenuous lung injured patients. Yeah, we get them occasionally, but the majority of patients, I'm using simple vent modes. And when I get one of these complicated modes, yeah, I can employ it, but I really don't want to be using these modes I'm unfamiliar with. But I
Yeah.
don't know. That's just me. This is a real world podcast. So I like to talk about how things really are.
Yeah,
But
and I think like my one strong like kind of take home message that I want to just arm people with is that, as a practitioner that has used multiple types of ventilators, and I've been practicing now for 17 years, and through very many different iterations of, care and how to ventilate. And at the end of the day, the core to what I do as a practitioner, day in, day out, doesn't matter the lung pathology, doesn't matter what's going on. At the end of the day, you realistically need to master one control mode and one spontaneous mode. That's it. And the only spontaneous option is pressure support right now. Realistically, we don't have another mode right now that is an option for spontaneous. So pressure support, and then pick your poison. Do you want volume control or pressure control? Pick one. Feel good about it, know that mode in and out. And I don't just mean setting a rate and a volume or a pressure and calling it a day. I mean understanding the secondary options to that mode. Grow there, grow some more, ventilate every lung pathology under the sun for years and years and years and years, so that you know how to manipulate that mode, and then you will be fine to ventilate any patient under the sun. And if you can do that, you'll be successful every time. If you are new to vents, at the end of the day, if there was a practitioner in front of me that I was teaching vents to, I would go through the control modes, and whatever one they gravitated towards, volume or pressure, great. Okay, that's your mode of choice, and you're going to go with that. And then I don't care. Like, and I always use this example to drive this home. When I first graduated, I worked at two different hospitals at the same time. I was full-time at one, and I was a 0.5 at the other. And my one hospital, all of their protocols were written in volume control. They followed the original ARDSNet protocol, which was volume control ventilation. And I ventilated neuro patients, septic patients, like COPD patients, fibrotic, every pathology under the sun. And then I went to my other hospital the following day, and all their protocols were written in pressure control. And I ventilated neuro patients, septic patients, respiratory patients, fibrotic patients. Like, at the end of the day, I don't give a shit. Same thing. Pressure or volume, pick one. That's your mode of choice.
I love it.
And then
so
you have your
you are saying, in effect, that as long as you are safely ventilating the patient, they're oxygenated, they're exchanging gases, and their pressures aren't high, it really doesn't matter, pressure or volume.
It doesn't. It 100% doesn't.
I love it.
And
I love it.
And honestly, like, I have had these conversations with physicians and like with RTs, and And we've talked about how, oh, I like pressure better. I like pressure better because it's more comfortable for your patient. And I turn to them and say, you're a lazy practitioner, because that's untrue. If you actually understand how to use volume control, and you know how to use all those secondary options of playing with your flows and really looking at your expiratory, like sensitivity and all of those different things, everything you can do in one, you can do to the other. They are literally the same thing. They are two sides of the same coin.
Love it.
Volume is pressure, pressure is volume. And at the end of the day, if you're ventilating with a Hamilton, which most of us are in the transport world, let's be honest, you don't have a volume control mode, you have a pressure mode. Your
This is
VC
true.
mode is a pressure mode. So like, check your ego. It's the same thing. We're doing the same thing.
If you just real quick want to touch on the Hamilton, everybody wants to get the Hamilton because it looks cool, and it is a friggin' amazing ventilator. I'm actually having another respiratory therapist come on from Delaware who's now a Hamilton rep, and he's going to talk about Hamilton. I don't get paid by Hamilton. I wish I did, but I don't. But it's essentially all pressure ventilation.
Yeah, it's and I don't want to steal their thunder. I want them to be able to share. No. But absolutely, like, I'm not at all affiliated with Hamilton either, and I have used many a transport ventilator in my day, and it's by far, it is an ICU ventilator in a small box that we can take on assets with us. Like, it really is. It is an amazing ventilator. But it's volume. It's CMV plus, which is their volume control option, that's labeled as a volume control mode, is actually a volume targeted mode of ventilation. So it's actually a pressure control that just has a volume target associated. So all it's done in the background is that instead of setting your pressure, you are setting the volume target for the vent to push the pressure up and down to hit. And then there's a servo feedback that's like, oh, we didn't quite hit it. Let's dial up that pressure a bit. Whoops, we overshot. Let's back it off a bit.
Awesome. All right. Let's talk about the thing that brought you and me to become friends on the social media sphere. You sent me a message about how SIMV is not a good mode and how you hate it. And that started a back and forth that eventually led to you coming on the podcast. Let's hear it. Why because we are taught, at least in the Mid-Atlantic, SIMV is way better than volume assist control. You can use it for weaning. It's safer. Let's hear what you have to say.
So I think the specific comment that I said that started this beautiful friendship was that you had made a post about dopamine being a bad drug, and my reply was,
yes,
SIMV is the dopamine of modes.
100. Yes.
Yeah, whatever it can do, another drug can do better. And SIMV is the exact same thing. Whatever SIMV can do as a mode, another mode can do better. And I stand by that 100%. And I literally will cut someone that says differently, and I will show them the research. So, okay. So
I thought you Canadians weren't violent. You're supposed to be polite.
When it comes to SIMV, there is no politeness, because I will be brutally honest. It fundamentally puzzles me that for some reason pre-hospital medicine is the only place where SIMV is still used. Like, I'll be honest, there's a study that was published back in 2016 that looked at the SIMV usage in all first world countries, not just Canada and the US. I'm talking about Australia. I'm talking about Europe. And guess what? SIMV utilization was 0 to 6%. 0 to 6%. Like, and this is not new. Like, since I have been practicing, SIMV has not been used. Like, the last research that showed that it should be abolished was in like 2000. And even research within 2016 is still saying, why is this mode not being used or still being used? It, like, everything that it does is inherently not great. The idea behind it. Okay, so there's lots of things. Lots and lots of things. But the idea behind SIMV, we all know. So it's the idea behind it, the theory, was this beautiful mixed mode, right? So that we have a minimum that we set. And as long as the patient's breathing more than that, they're breathing on their own. But then if at any point they stop triggering, the vent's gonna kick in a breath. That was the idea of it. And I will caveat that with saying that as of SIMV right now, it is an awful mode. But I'm sure that it's going to come back and be revamped. But I guarantee you it will be rebranded with a different name, because everyone is so, within critical care, is so like against SIMV that they can never use that name anymore. But
Okay.
going back to why. So first of all, by the 1980s, they literally, that's how far back EMS unfortunately is with how undated they are. In the
I'm
1980s,
not shocked.
they figured out that there was a difference when it came to weaning patients specifically between SAMV and every other mode. And by the 2000s, they came out and said, for sure, yes, we now have research to prove over and over and over again that it is the only mode that is proven to cause increased vent days, increased ICU stays, increased length of hospital stay. It's the only mode. Everything else, whether you're doing spontaneous breathing trials daily, weaning your pressure supports, using CPAP, using T-pieces, nothing else made any difference except they knew SAMV caused the mechanical ventilation time to increase. They proved that. So they're like, okay, it's not a good weaning mode, probably shouldn't be used. So that they then decided. Then there was a bunch of other research that happened, specifically around asynchrony. And they found that SIMV as a mode is one of the absolute worst modes to cause asynchrony with a ventilator. And if you look at any of the research on asynchrony, it causes a cascade of issues, specifically with sleep and specifically with the circadian rhythms of the patients, which we know is bad for healing.
Not to interrupt your flow, but this goes against everything I have ever been taught about SIMV. We're taught
yes,
you are promoting synchrony because you're letting the patient breathe.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Continue. I'm just fill me in.
Here's why I think that's happened. And honestly, it mystified me too. Like when I made the jump to transport and I started coming across and like chatting with a bunch of paramedics and hearing them over and over talking about SIMV, and I'm like, whoa. Like at this point I'd been working for, 12 years, and I'm like, this is not used in critical care medicine. This is like, since I've started, I learned about it in school and came to my first day of clinical, and they're like, absolutely not. It's literally like the worst thing you could possibly do to your patient. Like you are harming your patient. And I think it's because within the world of paramedicine, that when it comes to ventilators, it's been paramedics teaching paramedics. And it's been this passing down of paramedics training others within the field versus a multidisciplinary team that you see within other forms of medical training, where physicians sometimes are trained by RTs, and RTs are training nurses, and nurses teach RTs, and you know what I mean?
I have never heard a lecture until now by a respiratory therapist, and that's fucked up.
Yeah, it's the one thing that I think collaboration is a huge magic, and I think when there are experts, seek them out and find them. And I think that specifically when it comes to mechanical ventilation, like part of the reason why Rage wrote my book was someone handed me a book written by a paramedic teaching mechanical ventilation for transport, and I said, like, why does this exist?
I'm pretty sure I know which one you mean.
Yeah, and I literally said, like, why? Like in my mind, where is an RT's book or a physician book for mechanical ventilation? And then I searched them, and I found ones by physicians, but they were way too high. And I literally found nothing written by an RT, and I was like, this can't happen. So I was like, I'm gonna just start writing on my transports. Like I was literally
phenomenal.
Yeah. So back to SIMV. So
all right,
we know bad for weaning. Only thing you can do to actually fuck up your weaning is put a patient on SIMV. That's proven 1980 to 2000. Then asynchrony came into the mix, and they said, crap. One thing we know is that patients that are on SIMV are way more asynchronous than any other patient. And literally, we definitely know asynchrony specifically is really, really bad for healing. And it's really bad for your diaphragmatic muscle strength. Like there's been tons of studies. There was one I read that like horrified me. And yes, it was on a rat and not a human, but like it dealt with actually like killing the rats and looking at their diaphragmatic muscle function on a ventilator. And like just the loss of diaphragmatic muscle tone when it came to like having asynchrony on a vent. It's a scary thing. It's a scary world. So we know asynchrony is bad. SAMV, worst mode for it. There's so many missed triggers. And like, if you think fundamentally about the mode, if you think about the fact that that backup rate that you set, it is blind to the patient. So yes, there is the S, meaning synchronize. It's supposed to mean that it's not blind to the patient, but it actually still kind of is. So if you set your backup rate at 10, that means every 6 seconds your vent is going to be delivering a breath, right? Now, they're supposed to be, if the patient triggers a breath within like 0.5 second window, that the vent will not give that breath, which is great. But what happens when the vent delivers a breath and it triggers a breath, which always happens? So you end up having a double trigger. You have like they call it a reverse trigger, where the machine gives a breath and that actually stimulates the patient enough that they then trigger on top. And it ends up causing like first of all, it can cause, there's some research that they're like worried about actual increased risk of barotrauma when that happens, because you're almost like double stacking and causing like a shoot up of your intrathoracic pressure and all these different things. I think more research needs to come out regarding that, but I digress. But we know it's bad. We know that this means that the diaphragm is not in sync with the ventilator, and that we have that issue way more with SIMV. So why not put your patient in an AC? If you see them triggering, consider flipping them to a spontaneous if you're able to do that. If not, then, start to decrease your rate and play with your eye time to match your patient so that the breath delivered by the machine is actually being delivered to match what the patient wants if you're not going to let them breathe. That is better. And it's a lot more easy to recognize, and it's a lot more easy to control by like watching how your patient's breathing and manipulating your breath to match it, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense.
I'm not done my list yet either. There's more reasons why
please
it's
continue.
So one other thing that I wanted to mention as well is about work of breathing. So the other thing that they've realized now with a lot of studies is that with SIMV is that the body's not smart enough to know that there might be a mixed workload within the breaths. So we know that there's fully supported breaths where there's control breaths. And this is where this really leads into keeping them on a control mode. So there's these fully supported control breaths, and then there's these spontaneous breaths that the patient's supposed to pull. And yes, you can put pressure support on it, but now they have to control it, and they have to work a little bit more and have diaphragmatic, use. But the problem is that if the last breath was a controlled breath and delivered completely by the ventilator, the brain expects that the next breath is going to be fully controlled, and then it isn't. And then the body doesn't necessarily work as hard to get what it wants. And then the brain goes, oh crap, I have to work harder. And then the next breath might be a controlled breath, but the brain's like, I'm going to work harder, and works harder. So that even though it looks like the breath's supported, the diaphragm actually is still working too hard. So that when they actually looked at the diaphragm firing and the work of the diaphragm, they were noticing that it wasn't necessarily jiving with the mixing of the breaths. And that's why AC is a lot better of an option there, to stay with like a controlled breath each time, no matter what. If that makes sense.
Again, it does make sense. What's next on the list?
Let's see. So talked about, and then also before 2000, they also determined that you actually have better control of your gases and your pH with a control mode versus SIMV, that you'll be able to get to your target CO2s and your pH in less time, like within 4 hours of ventilation on an AC or a control mode. I say AC, but it's a assist control or control mode versus SIMV, that the gases were way better on a control mode, a fully supported versus an SIMV. And I think that's just reiterating the fact that, you're not getting necessarily equal ventilation. And you're also doing it at a lower pressure. You're able to actually get the better ventilation and better, minute ventilations overall in a control mode at a safer pressure level than you're getting in SIMV. And I think that also has to circle back to the workload of the muscles and things like that.
All right, let's you said you want to talk about waveforms a little bit. I think we can probably wind this down by you talking about what about the waveforms?
So once as
the
a practitioner,
waveform.
Yes, yeah. Once as a practitioner, the other thing that I kind of wanted to just introduce is um, is talking about how important having a basic understanding of waveforms is. And I'm not talking about like pulling like a flex and like an ego trick and like putting up a loop, like a flow volume loop. Ain't nobody got time for that. You're not getting information that's really going to benefit you. Like, yes, the Hamilton can throw up a loop and you can like, I always joke about like, you look at the football and whether the football is like flatter or more upright, and like a flat football is a bad thing, but no one wants that. At the end of the day, the loops don't matter. The main waveform that you as a practitioner want to look at is your flow volume loop, because your flow time loop. You want to look at your flow, because that's going to give you the information on how your patient's synchronizing with your patient and all these things. But don't get there until you've mastered these other basics that we talked about. Understanding, starting at, good reasonable respiratory rates, starting at 8 mils per kilo, and then targeting your ventilation from there as your fundamental, and having your good control mode and your spontaneous. Once you've mastered those basics and you're ventilating safely and you're ventilating effectively in those areas, then the next thing that you'd want to move into is starting to look at understanding your flow time waveform and starting to see how to match your inspiratory time to really match your patient, and like making sure, again, like most people can recognize whether their I time is too short or too long. Most people can recognize whether they have gas trapping or not with that waveform. And you can also start to look for those asynchronies that I talked about, because that's also going to start to make you a more just comprehensive practitioner when it comes to ventilation, because that's that other missing piece that people don't understand about ventilation, is the importance of that asynchrony when it comes to patient outcomes, length of ventilation days and healthcare dollars, and like all these different things that really mean outcomes for your patients. And yes, you only have them for a short window, but you might start to notice that your patient is actually having a 1 to 4 asynchrony, which is very easy to have. And you're starting to recognize that in the waveform. And it's something that I would love to talk more about and start to talk about some specific waveforms and that you would see for these different things. But that's kind of the next frontier that I would suggest before, again, you get fancy with modes. Fundamentals and then waveforms. And that's going to make you an effective ventilator.
Are waveforms covered in your book?
No, they are not. But I do have a resource for you if you're interested.
Absolutely.
So there's an RT that is literally a waveform guru, and you can search his videos on YouTube. And I'm going to give him a non-affiliated shout out. I've literally only met the man once in my entire life, but I fangirl over him pretty routinely. Like, he's brilliant. And he is one of the foremost, I think, experts on waveform, like recognition of asynchronies and things like that. And his name's Tom Pirano. So last name is Piraino, Pirano. And he has a YouTube channel. And if you search through his videos, you'll find his vent videos. And he has a couple recorded talks on asynchrony. And I would suggest literally watching that video 4 times in a row, because every time I watch it, and I've seen him lecture the same lecture about 7 times in a row, I learn something new, and I take a little bit more away when it comes to waveforms and becoming an expert at being able to really ensure every breath delivered is the best breath for that patient, and about recognizing what setting that I need to change, whether I'm actually going for my PEEP, or whether I'm actually touching my I time, or whether I'm looking at my expiratory cycling of the breath, and all those different things. You can recognize it within the waveforms, and then start to fix it. And I know someone out there is going to think, oh, I'll just sedate the crap out of them. Well, guess what? There's actually one asynchrony that happens because of too much sedation, that unless you're paralyzing them, which I personally don't think is necessarily the best option for every patient, because you're losing the spontaneous diaphragmatic work of your patient. You're causing higher increased interthoracic pressures for no reason. But sedation actually can cause an asynchrony in and of itself that you don't necessarily want to do.
I've never heard of this. I enlighten me.
So that one is very similar to that reverse trigger that I mentioned, where if a patient is too sedated, where they are in this like awkward window where they are too sedated to initiate a breath on their own, but stimulation of a breath delivered is enough to cause them to pull a breath. and you end up getting this weird spike on the inspiratory side of your inspiratory flow time loop. And that when you see that, and once you, if you watch one of Tom's videos, you'll see it once and you'll never not see it. Like, it is something that's very easily recognizable. And when you see that, think in your mind your patient's oversedated. And literally the only solution to that is waking your patient up and putting them on spontaneous. That literally is the solution to that fix, other than paralyzing your patient. There is no other option. The sedation will not fix the problem. It will make it worse.
All right. When you say wake your patient up, that seems, yeah, not fully. That seems anathema to everything we do in critical care transport. Because I've always said, people, and those of you who aren't seeing this on video and are listening, I'm going like this with my fingers, like making little movements. And people go, "Get the Versed!" as soon as you see them like wiggle their fingers a little bit.
But like, there is an opportunity to potentially find a different type of sedation, or potentially up, the pain medication you're associating and decrease the
I'm big on anesthesia over sedation.
Exactly. Like, optimize your fentanyl, decrease the propofol, or like whatever you're doing. Like, I know ketamine is very popular in transport, and it is a great drug. I'm not here to bash it. Like, it is a good drug. So, if you have a patient in that situation, maybe consider, switching the sedation you're giving to ketamine, so that might be a better option. Or, consider Precedex if that's an option for you, if you have that drug. So absolutely.
Me personally, I have found, like, I love ketamine and all, but I have found that for my vent patients, and not someone who's like a hot trauma or shocky, I have found that 50, even 25 of fentanyl is enough to chill them out.
Yeah.
Especially like the little old ladies who are on a vent. You give them 25 of fentanyl, they're happy.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know, like, coming from an ICU world and an anesthesia world, there is still a part of my practice that propofol is still, a wonderful drug, as long as you know how to use it and what patients to use it on and which ones not to use it on. So, like, I still come from that biased world where, great fentanyl and a teeny bit of propofol will do wonders for the majority of the patients. But obviously, pick your patients appropriately and all that good stuff. But yeah, fentanyl is a magic drug when it comes to vented patients. And it sometimes is enough to manage them. And sometimes just a little bit of Versed and fentanyl works great together. And that's all you need. So, like, getting a bit creative with that sedation is a great option, as long as, and you can do it safely and keep them at a RASS of, -2, -3, but not be -4, and so snowed that they're now like in that awful stage where they're not ventilating appropriately and their drive to breathe is no longer there.
I have one more question and then we will wrap this up. This has blown by. I can't believe we're at 50 minutes already. I was teaching the flight medical provider class this past weekend, and I have always been taught that if you want to increase oxygenation and fix hypoxia, you increase PEEP. However, the other instructor, who is an amazing instructor and somebody who I consider more intelligent than me, said you increase FiO2 first. And then I've heard another instructor who I really respect say that. But this goes against what I have been trained. So, patient drops their pulse ox. What are you going to do? PEEP or FiO2?
The question to that is, by how much? How much did they drop their sats? Because, like, the short answer to your question is that in most cases, yes, PEEP is going to work, but it's not going to work right in the moment that you need it to work. It's slow. It's a slow process. You're recruiting alveoli. You're increasing the driving pressure to push the oxygen across the alveolar capillary membrane, but that takes time. PEEP takes time. You're looking at minimum 30 minutes, if not longer, for you to get the adequate, bang for your buck. So if you have a patient that acutely is dropping their sats, most of the time you're going to have to up both and then back off on the FiO2 as you get the bang for your buck from your PEEP. Your instantaneous is your FiO2. Your eventual fix is going to be your PEEP most of the time when you're dealing with some type of issue where you're having some shunt.
I think we're going to have to name this episode Melody Teaches Mike About Vent Stuff.
God.
This has been awesome.
Well,
all right. Well,
again, it's something I could talk about all day. And like, Like it's very easy for me to just fall into the mode of just like deviating and
No
getting on my
pun
soapbox
intended.
and talking. Yeah.
You didn't say once.
But I think I said, does that make sense, about 14 times. So tomato, tomato. I think I did a similar thing.
Yeah, don't worry, we'll edit it out. All right, and we'll add subtitles for your Canadian accent.
Do I have an accent?
Yeah.
Well, you have an accent too, so
I don't see it, but everybody tells me I very much have. I never thought I had a Philadelphia accent, but I do.
I
I've
didn't
come to
say
grips
A
with it.
once.
No, you didn't. You said a boot, and literally.
I don't say a boot, I say about. About. You can leave this in.
You said a combination. It wasn't a boot, but it was a boat.
About, yeah.
It's
And
about.
literally. No, it's not about.
All right. Well, I'm going to stop this. Hold on. Thank you for coming on, everybody. This has been the lovely Melody. Check out her vent book. I'll post a link.